One of the biggest questions that people ask when they're looking at other individuals that are trying to get into recovery is, why don't they just learn to be different? Why don't they just learn a new way of being? And the truth to it is there's a whole bunch of barriers to learning for people in recovery, and we'll talk more about that today. So one of the things that we think about when it comes to addiction recovery is there's this notion of unlearning behavior. And I know there's a buzzword out there, and it's something that's talked about a lot. And I think that we assume that the behavior that comes from addiction is something that is just unlearned. And I don't know about you, but I struggle with unlearning something that's already in my mind. So if I was to say to you, forget what 2 + 2 is, you probably couldn't just unlearn that because it's in your brain. So something that's so hardwired as addiction gets in our brains. And when it's stuck there, it's really hard to shake out. So the important part is to recognize that we don't need to unlearn something as much as we need to learn something new. So if I learn something new, then the old way of doing things would become, for lack of better words, archived. And the new way of learning would be what would take place in the process of my day-to-day living. But people with addictions have some barriers to that learning process. And it's not because it's intelligence, because some of the smartest people I know are people that are in addiction or have had addiction or addiction recovery. And it's not about intelligence, there's more to it. So people have some specific barriers that I don't think a lot of people recognize that they have. So we're going to go over some of the key barriers. And the first one that stands out the most is it's being in survival mode. And I don't think many realize that when we are in addiction, it's not just party time. It's not just elation and going into celebration and just not caring. The reality of it is the central nervous system is going up and down, and there's emotional upheavals, and there's problematic things that happen in life, and there's all of that stuff. And part of it puts people into survival mode. So when I go into survival mode, if I was to, say, for example, be in a classroom and I'm trying to teach children how to learn something new, like their times table, right? But there was a fire or there was something dangerous happening in the room, the likelihood of them being able to focus and concentrate on the new learning behavior is really small because they're going to focus on whatever the danger is. So when we're in survival mode, it's very difficult to learn new things. So the individual in addiction needs to figure out a different way to process and get out of that survival mode, which is something we can talk a little bit about later. But that part of being in survival mode becomes a huge barrier. We've all heard of dopamine and the power that it has. We think that dopamine is just a feel-good chemical. And in truth, it is partially that, but it's also a motivational chemical and it's a teaching chemical. So when you get a spike of dopamine and you feel good around something that you would ingest or have or seek, then the dopamine levels increase. So we end up learning better. And this is the reward process that comes. So if I was in the woods, one of my ancestors in the woods hundreds of thousands of years ago, and they find some berries, they would eat those berries and the dopamine would go off and it would say, remember those berries, remember where they were, remember, the day, the weather, what was going on, who you were with. And it would help you to remember that information. You can see that drugs and alcohol actually spike dopamine levels really high. So when they spoke dopamine levels really high, then the environment and the things that a person with an addiction is around will become learned. And it will be deeper ingrained in the mind to remember who I was with, where I was with, what I was doing. So then those things become more important to the individual with the addiction. So learning a new way, it has a lot less dopamine and it doesn't drive me towards learning something that doesn't give me any pleasure. It doesn't give me any stimuli. So that becomes a barrier to learning a new way because it doesn't really do anything for me. Coping mechanisms are extremely underrated when we talk about addiction, and taking care of how I feel emotionally is really important to an individual who's struggling with substance use. So usually you can see, and you can see this with other people, not just people with addictions in the traditional sense of drug and alcohol, but if you see somebody that leans towards caffeine or sugar and you put them into a stressful situation, they're reaching for that coping mechanism that helps to soothe their emotional state. So my coping mechanism that's external to me has a really big value. It gets really, really important. It's trusted. It's always there. So when you come up to somebody and you ask them to learn something that is counterintuitive to their coping mechanism that they have built and worked for and done so much work to build upon, you're threatening something that is crucial to their life, to who they are, and to what's going on. So asking somebody to learn a new way that has such a huge impact on how they manage their life and that will challenge that then becomes a barrier, and people want to shut down because they're like, I don't want to learn a new way. And that's the relevance that substance use has to somebody. Challenging that coping mechanism makes it so that people will shut down. They're not going to learn. So they become objective, or not objective. They object to the idea very quickly. So we can't learn when we're in that mindset. When you learn something, you use the results of what it is that you've learned to determine whether or not it was something that made sense to you. If I went to go change the tire on a car and it worked and it was successful, then I'd be like, oh, okay, now I know how to change a tire in a car. And I can see that that was a successful result. When you're dealing with individuals going through something that is so diverse and there's so many moving parts to change and learning, what can happen is the individual will attempt to try something new. In the process of learning, they will try something new and then not get results. So then not getting results would tell the person that doesn't work. So with somebody with addiction, they might go, and the analogy I'll use, I'll stay on the car tire analogy. When you go and change a car tire, if two of the tires were flat, but I only changed one tire, then I'd be like, well, that didn't work. My car doesn't drive right. Or I changed a tire, but the car's still out of gas. Or I changed the tire and there's no steering wheel. There's all of these other variables. So then you say, oh, that didn't work. So in addiction recovery, people, not just the people in addiction, but people outside of that, make assumptions that there are these things that will just work. And if I do that one thing, my life will be better. If I just got a job, if I just got in a relationship, if I just got sober for a couple of weeks, if I just got, so this is one idea of just doing this one thing. So when an individual goes to learn that new skill or do that one thing, and then it still doesn't work, then they, the old adage is they throw out the baby with the bathwater. So I go and I change the tire and I go, well, that didn't work. Car still doesn't run. So I'm going to just forget about even trying to remember that changing a car tire even worked. So the learning process is the recognition that we need to see results. So when people are in addiction, they struggle with seeing the result because maybe they're in chronic relapse. Maybe they're going back and forth. Maybe they're still having these struggles. So there's not a tangible thing to say, hey, that worked. Right? So that becomes a barrier to learning in a new way. Not that they don't know how to learn, it's just seeing a tangible result doesn't allow them to see the outcome. So like stated earlier, this is not a matter of intelligence. We can see that in our education system, there's a lot of it that is focused on memory or the ability to retain and hold information and being able to regurgitate it and bring it back up. Sometimes there are barriers to individuals to be able to do that. So maybe there's additional mental health, maybe there's learning disabilities, maybe there's dyslexia, maybe there's ADHD. There's something, professionals would call comorbidity, which means that there's maybe some mental health that overlaps with the addiction. There's a potential for learning disorders and that sort of thing. So in that, it doesn't mean that the person is inferior, but our system is designed to go towards teaching the average individual. It's not geared towards teaching individuals. It's geared towards teaching the average. So we find in the addiction field that a lot of the individuals that struggle are the outliers. They're the people that just have a different way of learning. So when they have a different way of learning, people just don't teach them how to learn the way that they need to learn. So the result is that an individual will be taught a certain way, and then they don't retain that information because that's maybe not how they learn. Maybe they learn in a more hands-on way, or they learn in different perspectives, or whatever it may be. And then the outcome of that is there must be something wrong with me. We did talk on another one of these episodes about shame, which I'd encourage you to look more at. But the concept is that I feel a sense of there's something wrong with me, I'm broken, I don't fit in. And then learning isn't the same anymore. Learning becomes arduous, it becomes difficult, it becomes shameful and hurtful. And it's easier for me to avoid some learning situations and stay away from them because I know it's just going to turn into something that hurts and doesn't feel good. So then when we approach individuals with addictions now, and we're trying to say, hey, you need to learn a new way, and you got to figure out there's some education you have to do, and maybe you got to do some homework, and you have to do some stuff. They're, going to be programmed inside themselves to be, hey, I don't like learning. This is terrifying. Like, I'm going to be rejected. I'm going to be hurt, or this is going to be difficult. So when I have an emotional charge as a result of trying to achieve something, again, it goes back to that survival mode we talked about, but it also means that if I'm going to have an emotional charge, I'm not going to really have a big desire to do that. It's not going to be something I'm looking forward to doing. And we have something with the addiction that is based on, like I said, coping and dealing with an emotional state and instant gratification. And if given the opportunity while in active addiction to choose learning and discomfort and potential shame, or instant gratification and feeling at ease and peaceful and, intoxicated, then it's an easy choice to be like, you know what, we'll leave the learning for later, right? So it's not that they don't have the capacity again, but there's an association that might be creating a barrier to learning. So what do we do about it? So there's certain things that are really important to recognize when it comes to figuring out how to learn. And we like to think that, hey, I know how to learn. I learn every day. I've learned, I've grown, I've evolved. Some people that are in addiction recovery, did well in school, and they say, I can learn, I do good. And so the thing that we do want to recognize is that we're not just trying to learn facts. We're actually trying to learn a different emotional state. So the learning and the way that it's done is done a little bit differently, or potentially could be done differently. So what happens is if we just ingest a whole bunch of facts, but I don't know how to apply those facts or integrate them into my life, then I'm going to have more barriers. So we want to look at this in a bit of a different way and note some specific things that we can do to increase my ability to learn when it comes to addiction recovery. So that's what this episode is all about. It's all about understanding the ways that I can tweak and adjust my learning. So first and foremost is personalize it. So like we had already said, people have different needs. We have different understandings. We have different ways that we look at things, and getting to learn and understand those ways through reflections of other people or looking at our past and seeing where we might have had barriers, we can start personalizing our education. Me personally, I love to watch videos in the morning. I'll get up and I'll find a YouTube video, and I'll go find something that I want to grow and evolve, and I do my learning first thing in the morning. So when I wake up in the morning, I might have my morning coffee, and I'll put on some videos, and I'll watch them, and I will consume and absorb information very quickly and easily, but that's for me. Now, if you told me that I had to go and sit in a classroom at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and try to absorb information, I would tell you probably not going to work best for me. If that's the only time the class is held, I'd have to figure that out as well. But I'm saying what we want to do is we want to look at how do we personalize our recovery and our learning to ourselves. And then when we make it personal, when we make it about me, opposed to being about the bigger classroom or trying to meet the status quo, then it becomes something that's more valuable to me. And that's really important when it comes to addiction recovery. It's not about learning for other people. It's not about learning for what they want. It's me learning to take care of myself and what it means and why it's important to me. So feedback and mentorship are probably one of the most powerful tools that we use in recovery. And it is obvious when we look at the 12-step model and we look at sponsorship and we look at how people engage in the recovery community. Mentorship and getting feedback from other individuals allows us to have a deeper reflection of who we are and what's going on. And that can be one of the barriers from our past as well, is maybe the people that were around us maybe didn't give us the best feedback, or maybe it was shameful or hurtful. So when we're trying to learn, the more people that I can find around me that have, in the 12-step world, they'll say, go find somebody, a sponsor that has what you want. You find an individual that has things and lives a certain way. And we're not talking about possessions. We're not saying somebody that has the big house that I want. We're talking about demeanors and attitudes and emotional states that you would want. And we go to those people and we'd be like, well, what do you do? How do you do it? How do I learn those ways? Because that's, one of the most powerful ways of learning is that's how we've learned most of our life. I learned from my parents. I learned from kids in the playground. I learned from seeing what happens and seeing how other people engage in their life. And that's a learning tool that we tend to put off on the back burner because we struggle with asking for help, or we struggle with recognizing it. It doesn't need to be in a negative way that you're not good enough or you don't know how to manage your own life. But if I wanted to learn how to, we'll say change a tire. If I want to learn how to change a tire, the easiest way to do is to ask somebody how to change a tire. And that's really important for me to be able to see and observe that. We're going to talk a little bit about retention in a minute and how we retain information, and engaging with other individuals is a big part of that. Humility, not to be confused with being humiliated, but humility and coming from a space of not knowing and saying that, maybe I don't know all the answers. Maybe I don't know what's going on. We talked about the barriers earlier of, thinking that I did change the tire and that didn't work. So the humility is to be like, I changed the tire last time, but maybe there's more. Maybe there's more that I could learn from this. Maybe there's more that I could learn to understand. And what tends to happen is we believe and know that we're an expert in our own life. And I support that and recognize that and encourage an individual to be an expert in their own life. But sometimes that being an expert in my own life can get in my own way of making room for new information. So in doing that, sometimes we have to say like, hey, maybe I don't know. Maybe I don't know what's going on. And that allows me to be able to say, well, give me more information, and then I can decide what it is that I want to take from that. And one of the analogies I like to use is, the concept or the idea of going into a grocery store, and you walk into a grocery store, and if you have things that you don't like, you don't go to those things and yell at them in the grocery store. I can't believe there's Brussels sprouts in this grocery store. How dare they have Brussels sprouts? No, I don't focus on that. I go through and I select the things that I want and I need, and I can take those things and put them into my cart and I can leave. I don't need to make it about what I don't want. And this is, a nice example of humility, of being able to walk in and saying, you know what, there's those things there. Yep, there's Brussels sprouts, and, maybe one day I'll try them, or I don't know, other people like them. That's okay. But I can still go through and take the information that I want. But I can still be open to the idea that there's a whole store of information, a whole store of things that I can consume if I wanted to. But I still have the choice of whether or not I take it. But I can also see that there are other people, other options. There's 8 billion people on the planet. There's 8 billion views of how the world works. And humility allows us to say, you know what, I can recognize there's different things and different ways to learn things. And there's the old, the old adage, you can't, pour anything into a full cup. If it's full, it's full. So the humility is to say, you know what, I'm going to take something out of my cup so that there's room for new things to come in. So being teachable is a major part of byproduct of humility. Become curious. And I think that's something that a lot of us lose. We lose a sense of curiosity when we're younger. And, you see kids, if you're around any young kids, and they're constantly saying, why? And it's adorable to watch them do that. But as we get older, as we go back to that last point of humility, we think that the things that I know and the things that I do kind of get in the way. And so I struggle with asking why, or asking questions, or being curious about things. And if I'm not curious, then therefore I'm not going to learn anything, because I need to ask questions to do that. So there's this playful feeling of being curious. So when I'm curious, and I'm genuinely curious, or even compassionately curious, and asking questions to understand things, that survival mode that we talked about tends to go down, because I'm not exploring and asking questions when I'm feeling in danger. I have a sense of curiosity. When you see a child at play, and they're playing and they're being curious or exploring and looking at things, it's not out of fear, it's out of learning, it's out of growth, it's out of evolution, to become better and understand things. And as we age, we tend to go to the things that we know, because that's comforting, and it's and oddly calorie efficient for me to just do what I've always done. And curiosity takes a little bit of energy. But looking at my recovery as this curious area of growth, it's something that's important to me. It's something that I want to do and understand. So when you look at anything that you've done well at learning, so if I wanted to learn about building model airplanes, you'd go online and you'd be like, hey, I'm curious about this. What about that kind of stuff? And what about the glue? And what about the paint? What about the thing? And you'd go in and you would find that curiosity, and you'd dive deeper into learning different things and different strategies and what happens. Addiction recovery is the same way. It's about learning life. So we like to think that maybe I understand that already, but once we find a curiosity in it to say, hey, I can be curious about this. I can go learn. And what is this? And what's that? And what's that? And oh, what's this? Right? And as we get excited about it, it becomes much easier to learn, because it's on my terms and I want to. So the last thing, and probably the most difficult, but the one that makes most sense, is making sure that we're in the right emotional state to learn. And like I said earlier, survival mode being a barrier, dealing with coping mechanisms being a barrier, and shame being a barrier. I think it's important that we take some time to focus on, how do I make myself feel safe and in an emotional state that will allow me to learn? And that's not always easy when we're dealing with things that have been maybe fractured in our life, or things that aren't going well, and dealing with uncertainty and danger. And that's, kind of how addiction recovery, the big movements in the 12-step world came about, was because a couple of gentlemen got into a room together, and then through their conversations felt safe. And in the process of feeling safe, they felt like they could talk more. Right. And then that, turned into an entire movement of, peer support groups of people sitting in a room with each other talking, because in those rooms they felt connected and safe to be able to do so. That's not always the option for everybody else. So then some would find counseling where they can go and sit in a room and feel safe to be able to grow and evolve and expand and maybe learn a new way. But I think that the takeaway is to say, how can you do that for yourself? Where are areas that I know I can go and feel safe while I'm learning? Or put myself into a positive emotional state while I figure out how to change my lifestyle, change the way I do things. Residential treatment centers tend to do that. People go into an environment and they go there for 28 days or, whatever it is, a couple, 3 months. And in that environment, they have reasonably safe environment. They got food, they got shelter, there's, people around, they know where they're coming and going. They have a set routine. And being in that safe environment allows them to kind of let go of all of the things that are happening on the outside world, so that they can feel safe and comforted emotionally to take care of, what's going on in their inside world, and being able to focus and learn and absorb that information while not being focused on all of the potential harms or dangers or survival mode that's happening. So doing that for yourself is really crucial to figuring out how you're going to learn to make the changes that you need to make in your recovery. And one other thing to note is when we look at going into recovery from addiction, in any other aspect of life, we are not, and we're trying to get into recovery from an injury, recovery from anything else, we're looking at returning to a previous state. If I hurt my leg, I just want it to go back to where it was. I want to go back to having my leg the way it was. In addiction recovery, it's not a about going back to a previous state because my previous state was addicted. My previous state was not working. My previous state led me to where I am today. So we're not necessarily going back to a previous state like most recoveries are. In this scenario, we're actually trying to grow and evolve into a new lifestyle, into a new way of being and a new way of learning, a new way of living in general. So we're not trying to stop the drug and alcohol as much as we're trying to have a life that doesn't require it. So we grow in that direction. So to bring this all home, there's one other thing that is important to recognize, and that's retention. And we can talk about the barriers, we could talk about the things that we can do to make it easier, but there's also a level of retention. And there's this thing called learning retention pyramid. And there's this pyramid and it shows you, the levels of how we can retain information. At the very tip of this pyramid, which is the smallest amount of retention, is lectures. To listen to a lecture, to listen to somebody else talk is a smaller amount of retention, probably because we're up in our own head and we're talking about thinking about other things or what I'm going to have for lunch or what's going on. Then as we go down that list, we can see that we have reading and we have other things that are non-participatory. So there's things that we do that we're not necessarily participating in, and the lower the participation, the lower the retention. So if I'm just trying to absorb information from afar, just maybe even listening to a podcast, I'll get some of it, sure, but I don't necessarily retain the way I think I'll retain. Now, when we look at the learning pyramid, keeping in mind that there's a lot of variables that can change this. It's not set in stone because they can move and shift, but we can see that there's a big difference between participating and not participating. So in the learning pyramid, when the retention gets greater, the greater the retention, the more participation there is. So when an individual participates in groups and talks about things that are going on or what they're learning, or able to have a conversation or discussion with another individual, the retention is greater. When they demonstrate, when they actually do some work and you can demonstrate, we'll go back to that tire. If I can sit there and do a tire and physically touch it and participate with it, the idea of me learning is going to be a lot greater than me just watching a video of changing a tire, but me doing it is different. Me doing it with other individuals, even greater. So then my retention becomes greater. And then lastly is teaching. When I get to a place where I teach that information, and I don't know if you've ever had this experience, I know a lot of people have, but you go into a workplace and then you're learning a job and all of a sudden the boss comes over and says, hey, can you teach Johnson over here how to do that thing? And you go, okay, sure. And then you go over and you start teaching him or her that thing. And as you're teaching him, you say, hey, wow, I actually do know this. I do recognize that I can do this. And so the teaching process actually creates even more retention. So while you're looking at overcoming these barriers and figuring out how to put more into your recovery through that, we want to keep in mind that we want to make sure that we're figuring out the best retention ways. And this is relevant to the emotional stuff. So I could have something that's really emotional to me and I might absorb it quicker, even though it's just a lecture, because it has meaning to me. So both things can be true. I can have those things that we had already talked about, the learning, the humility, the personalization, all that stuff. But then if we add groups, group activities, participation, doing action, then our retention and our learning goes through the roof. And that is crucial to learning how to live a life that is substance-free, or figuring out how to have a life that is free from addiction.